And ultimately, the gospel fulfills all those things. Christ comes in and gives us this ultimate narrative that actually answers the identity and experience and the story we all have inside of us.
Kevin, thank you for taking the time to hang with me for just a bit.
Yeah, great to be here, Tanner. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. So, okay, brother, just real quick, first off, your introduction is still my favorite part of my book. So, thank you again for that. You pack so much wisdom into just 3 pages or so. It's wild. And then, secondly, I love that you quoted the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, and specifically that quote in which he says, basically that human beings are storytelling animals. We are hardwired for stories. And that's what you do for a living as head of content with Hallow, which you're killing it, by the way. But in your own words, just real quick, why is story so important?
Yeah, well, first off, the foreword is definitely not the best part of the book. I would beg to differ. It's simply a way to get people to keep reading. But yeah, story is so interesting. I think there are a few things in my life that I want to be and have been dedicated to than story. You
Mm,
mentioned that Alistair McIntyre. Comes from this book called After Virtue. It's an incredible book, very complex, a little bit difficult. But he says this interesting thing for a philosopher to say. He says, man is a storytelling animal. Like
mm,
philosophers are like the essence of things, existential questions. Like, all right, what separates animals from men? And McIntyre says stories. And he goes on, he says, I can only answer the question, what am I to do? If I can first answer the previous question is which story or stories do I find myself a part of? And so for
mm,
McIntyre, he's pointing to this thing deep down that stories do and play in our lives, that there's something, yeah, existential about humans and story that's very deep within us and bring us a lot of meaning and identity. So it's really important to understand what stories we're living, to understand other people's stories. They make huge impressions on us. Or well, I think just being amidst stories is so important for us to recognize that and to realize that, and then yeah, to give us ourselves great stories in our lives.
absolutely. Yeah, I love that phrase that you just said. What stories are we living? I kind of like look at it as like we subscribe to certain narratives out there. So, for
Yeah.
example, it's a pretty popular narrative in today's time that all of this, all of creation is just a universal accident, just some sort of
Mm.
cosmic coincidence. And people who live in that story, who subscribe to that narrative, live kind of accidentally, just kind of indulging themselves over here, indulging themselves over there, wherever they coincidentally feel like it. This kind of like the inevitable conclusion of that narrative. Another popular one is that humanity is just on this path of constant progression, that we're just getting smarter and better than any generation that has come before us. And people who live in that story live kind of enslaved to the populace, like wherever the majority's huddled, like that must be where I have to go because that's where progress is headed. But we as Christians, we as Catholics, we claim that the story of the gospel is the story of reality, and like that's the story to live in. So I'm curious, like, why do you personally subscribe to the story of the gospel, and what's in it, so to say, for people who try to conform their lives to that story?
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. I've been going through Mere Christianity. We're going through that on Hallow here.
Hmm.
Actually started today, but it's interesting because Lewis says like when there's these things inside of us, they point to something much deeper. So he's like, we have these longings inside of us, or we have this desire for like right and wrong inside of us. And I think we have same thing with story. Like we have this story inside of us, and Lewis would say it's because there's some type of fulfillment to that story. There's some
Mm,
type of fulfillment to this experience we feel in our life, this need for this idea that we have this relationship or this ideal life out there. Somehow that we fall short of that ideal. Somehow we're redeemed from that. Like all those narratives are all throughout our history, all throughout who we are. And ultimately, the gospel fulfills all those things. Christ comes in and gives us this ultimate narrative that actually answers the identity and the experience and the story we all have inside of us. So I think for me, as someone who had a conversion fairly young, like 14 years old, but still at 14, I had this real deep sense of this experience in my life, all those narrative I mentioned about this ideal and this sin and brokenness, but also redemption. And Christ just seemed to
mm,
answer all those things for me, and not in like a vague way or conceptual way, but an actual like lived way that he came here on earth and lived these things. It wasn't a concept or idea, but it was a lived reality that not only Jesus lived that we could point to in history, but also that I could tangibly feel and live out my own life. And I think that that's what gave me like this ability to accept the gospel and to live it out, is that it felt more real, but also so much far beyond this world. And it felt both those things at the same time, to allow my heart to live in the now with that story, but also know that it's going somewhere too.
Man, wow. That's beautiful. That's such a great answer. I love how you tied in C.S. Lewis there. These deep aches that we have, these deep aches point to a fulfillment. And like for me, that's the work of evangelization. That's what I'm hoping to accomplish with this podcast, with my book, is pointing people to that ache and showing them the map to that fulfillment, and getting people
Yep.
to see that story as reality and then to enter into it and play their part, because everyone has a super important part to play. St.
Yeah.
Augustine has that
Absolutely.
quote: to fall in love with God is the greatest romance, to seek him the greatest adventure, and to find him the greatest human achievement. I mean, that's what it's
Mm.
all about.
Yeah.
So,
Incredible. Incredible.
man, well, Kevin, it is a shame that your introduction was only a few pages in my book. It's a shame that we only have a few minutes with this teaser episode. You're a fountain of wisdom, and it's an absolute gift to learn from you. You're a gift to so many people. Thank you again for being with me.
Awesome. Happy to be here, Tanner, and thanks so much. Appreciate it, man.